Well, the NRC, when I was working in the nuclear industry back in the 1980s, the rules were changed so fast that there were things that they said, you must install this equipment on every plant in the country. That is law. And so the company would go and invest in all this stuff. And less than a year later, they changed the rules and said, you must remove that equipment because it was the wrong idea. We tested it, it failed, and you are now legally obligated to remove it. So it was that volatile an environment, and people were still trying to make this work. And you wonder why we didn't build really barely any new reactors after the 80s and into the 90s, like nobody was doing it. There's only one. I think TVA is trying to get one built now and may or may not be successful right now on a existing nuclear power facility site. I'm not an unrestrained fan of nuclear power, but I think it's got some serious opportunity for us, especially in a transitional phase, as we're working away from combustion-based energy and working towards renewable.
Do you think that the general, many people experience fear towards nuclear power? Do you think that that influences how it's going to progress? And like, what are your
Yes, I think
opinions?
3 Mile Island, I think Fukushima Daiichi, and I think Chernobyl will be cited for at least another generation, maybe 2 generations, as reasons not to. I'm not necessarily one of them, but there are people in the nuclear industry who would say 3 Mile Island is actually the example of what went right. That is, things got so bad and yet there was no release of radiation into the public. Chernobyl, obviously, well, not obviously, the reactor and its support structures were nowhere near the kind of quality control, let alone intentional safety standards that we impose in the United States. In Japan, I think they had much higher quality control, but they still did some naive designs. You know, do you prepare for a 100-foot high tidal wave coming across the plant? Well, maybe, maybe not. If you're thinking that that's going to be there for a century, maybe you need to. So we need to be a little more thoughtful about how and where we design these. But, you know, France has been very, very successful with their nuclear power program for decades and decades. Canada has actually been quite successful with the nuclear power program. It's not a panacea, but as I said, I think there's opportunity. One of the problems is scale, okay? So when we're putting 1,000 megawatt reactors here and there, it takes up a huge amount of space. And there's a huge negative impact. So one of the things I like to think about in sustainability problems is, first, where's the waste? And how can I exploit that? How can I take advantage of it? So, tiny, tiny scale. In my kitchen, where's the waste? Well, there's all this food scraps. How could I take advantage of it? Well, we put chickens in the backyard. And the chickens give us eggs. Now, where's the waste for the chickens? Well, the chicken bedding becomes soiled, and that is now, what could I do with that? Well, I can put it in the compost pile. And then and that is very high nitrogen input to the compost pile, which needs it. The compost then goes to feed the plants, and then the plants feed us, and then the scraps feed the chickens. And so we go through that, and it is a beneficial cycle, as opposed to if I did the exact same thing on a huge scale, I'd have tons of chicken waste, and now what do I do with it, right? So part of the issue isn't the activity, but it's the scale of the activity. If I have a tiny plant, then I'm less opposed to having it near me. The not in my backyard issue is minimized. It will never go away. It was hard getting approval to build this cogeneration plant, but it's literally 60 feet from me, and most of the time I'm working in it, not near it. And it's very tolerable because it's the same scale as the buildings around it. It doesn't impose noise to the nearest neighbor. You can barely hear it a few feet away, even though we're running a very powerful jet engine inside. You wouldn't know it to walk by the outside of the building. The thermal waste, that if I was doing this on a huge, huge scale, I might need cooling towers to reject that heat, or I might need to be next to a river, or I might need to be next to a ocean. But because we're on a community scale, now what would otherwise be a waste on a large scale is a resource that I can exploit. So I can take the thermal, what would otherwise be a waste, and I can use it to heat an entire campus. I can heat 180 buildings with it, or I can use that energy to provide cooling for 12,000 people, right? So by bringing the scale down and adding inherently safe, one of the let me back up. One of the other things that we were terrible at and really failed at in the 1970s and 1980s was communication. All right. We as an engineering community said, "We got this. Don't worry. We know what we're doing. We're fine. Power's going to be so cheap we won't need to meter it." That was a quote back then, and it wasn't, and we didn't. But the more important problem was we hadn't gotten everybody's buy-in. We just said, "Don't worry, we got this." What we need to do is have humans interact with humans and talk to each other. A core concept in sustainability is community, is us working together. So we explain what we're doing. And then we put it on a neighborhood scale. And we say, the failure is not going to take out your house. The failure is not going to take out you. So it's not that level of risk. And then we educate everybody as to why we're doing what we're doing. And then we work together. I think it's doable.
How do you think we can educate people on a mass scale? Like,
We can't. We have to do it one-to-one. Every single person needs to understand. Or at least everyone is willing to. It won't be on a mass scale. It'll be you telling 3 people and me telling as many people who will sit still and listen to me.
and in short, why should people care about energy? Like, it's not something that people think about a lot. Like,
Let me meditate on that a little bit.
okay.
If you only care about yourself, if you only care short term, if you only care first cost, maybe not. If you care about the next generation, let alone 7 generations forward, if you care about anybody other than yourself, if you care about anybody other than sort of rich, white, upper middle class, Western, whatever we want to say, we live much better than the rest of the world, almost all the rest of the world. If you are willing to acknowledge the impact of your own activities, that they probably outweigh the benefit of your own activities, that your own existence, the way it's lived right now, has a pretty negative impact on the planet. If you're willing to acknowledge that and do the math and sort of add it up, or even just accept it, then it's necessary to move towards a different form of energy delivery and energy production than we have today. I mean, in simple terms, you got to acknowledge global warming. If you don't, we could still have a conversation, but it's going to be a different conversation. If you're willing to talk about life cycle cost of your activity as opposed to, I only care about the next 3 months, which is really what corporate quarterly earnings call do. You know what a quarterly earnings call is? All right. We're running a company, and every 3 months, we have to have a telephone call with investors, and they're going to say, how did you do the past 3 months, and how are you going to increase your profitability over the next 3 months? What does that force us to do? It forces us to make the most short-term possible decisions, and it forces us to not make thoughtful long-term decisions. I think quarterly earnings call are, the most extreme tool to force
Got your email.
the CEOs and CFOs of companies to make the worst possible decision. I think because they're all about short-term profitability, and they're not at all about long-term profitability or good decision making. We can invert this, but again, this is a rules-based thing. It's not a technical-based thing. What if we taxed profits at 99% tax in the first 10 seconds? So, if you're a quantitative investor and you invest in something just based on computer algorithms, they're going to invest and 10 seconds later maybe sell that position in the market, you're going to be taxed at 99%. But after 10 minutes, we'll only tax you at 90%. And after 10 hours, maybe 80%. And then 10 days, maybe 70%. And 10 weeks, 60%. And ultimately, and we can draw this curve at different slopes. But ultimately what you do is say, if you're going to invest for thinking 100 years forward, maybe there's no tax at all. If you're willing to really invest in the society, if you're willing to really invest in the community, and you'll still get a benefit. But this is more like the model that a farmer needs to think in terms of, and not a short-term quantitative investor, which I put at the opposite end of the spectrum, especially an organic farmer versus a short-term market quantitative investor. Because one is all about investment in a specific place and in things that are healthy for themselves, healthy for the community, healthy for the land. And the other is purely extractive with no value added at all. So, I'm showing you two different ends of the spectrum and showing you that we can tweak this with rules, not technology. Did that help any? Or